topic is one that I've been given some thought for some time, and there's actually scarce literature on this. But last year, an academic and strategy consultant in Europe, Andrew Chakoyan, wrote a piece entitled 4 Lessons in Corporate Diplomacy. In the age of tech assured transparency, doing well by doing good is bound to transform from aspiration of a few to an imperative of all. Corporate diplomats will lead the way, he said. And if you follow the barrage of media coverage and policy debates around technology and society these days, it is really hard to disagree. And yet most tech companies, including sophisticated ones, have not invested in developing the competencies and the organizational skills that are needed to succeed in the current environment. This literature on corporate diplomacy is mostly a 21st century phenomenon because many of the challenges, even though they have root in the 20th century, have really been exacerbated in the 21st. So today I'd like to explore the business environment global companies operate in, with a particular focus on tech companies, which is the sector in which I've spent a quarter of a century of my professional experience. But first, let me give you a bit of context. After the golden years of globalization in the 1980s and 90s, in the 21st century, and particularly after the global recession, we have entered into what Ian Bremmer calls the age of guarded globalization. In this stage, there's a very different flavor of globalization. It is slow-moving, selective, and with a heavy dash of nationalism and regionalism. The trend, by the way, is only going to be exacerbated in the aftermath of the pandemic. So multinational companies are facing global legitimacy challenges. They're accused as engaging in tax avoidance, using low-wage countries for corporate benefits only, disrespecting privacy regulations, abusing consumer data, violating local community rights, exploiting natural resources, ignoring basic human rights, and employing too many lobbyists targeting national and international political decision-making processes for their own corporate interest. Although many of these challenges are not new, as I said, they have resurfaced and become more apparent during the last decade. So it is clear that expectations of business are changing as rapidly as the world around us, and that the tech sector must urgently focus on restoring trust in themselves vis-a-vis society. Corporations must find a way to lead was the consensus view that emerged from the 2017 Edelman Trust Barometer. 75% of respondents agree that a company can take specific actions that both increase profit and improve the economic and social conditions in the community where it operates. A contemporary CEO cannot afford to ignore this sentiment. The era of corporate social responsibility as a cost of business has passed, and the era of doing well by doing good is upon us. Nielsen, a marketing company that popularized this concept, predicts that doing good henceforth might become a prerequisite for doing well. A successful business today needs to develop a genuine narrative that congruently articulates the value for society this business creates, defines what leadership philosophy is, and what the company stands for. And then it must demonstrate to its stakeholders that it means to live by it in real ways, that this is more just than a PR messaging stunt. This way, the business can earn what some have called a social license to operate, which is the ongoing acceptance of a company or industry standards business practices and operating procedures by its employees, stakeholders, and the general public. A social license to operate is created and maintained slowly over time as the actions of a company build trust with the community and with other stakeholders. Doing this will require new leadership skills that are rare today. And we will discuss later, the external affairs departments of technology companies, or sometimes called corporate affairs departments, are best positions to lead the way to help these companies connect the synergy dots of public and private value creation. Andrew Chakoyan, that I mentioned before, cleverly started his piece by referring to a story according to which in ancient China, physicians were paid a retainer fee as long as their patients remained healthy. But if you became sick, the fees were suspended until and unless the doctor could bring you back to health. What a concept. The key to corporate health and longevity is preempting problems rather than firefighting. Yet we've built muscle and capabilities to fight fires and very, very few capabilities to preempt the problems from arising. Even the most value-driven company needs at least 3 important stakeholders: customers, employees, suppliers. These traditional market stakeholders, of course, matter quite a bit, but it is the relevance of the non-market related stakeholders that is noteworthy. On the government side, tech companies must contend not only with disparate regulatory approaches to the same issues on a global basis, but in some cases, conflicting approaches that they have to manage on a global basis. Companies have to contend with the rise of activism, not only from the traditional sources like NGOs or civil society, but also their own activist shareholders, and in some cases, their own activist employees. It used to be that a tech company's product development process was simply think it, build it, box it, ship it, and then repeat. Tech companies also prided themselves that they would move fast and break things. Well, in the modern world of cloud computing and internet app services, where software sales are not a one-time box sale transaction, but ongoing relationships, user experience and customer loyalty and trust are as important as product differentiation. Trust is an indispensable prerequisite for success. In a sophisticated tech company, the responsibility to maintain healthy stakeholder relations often falls with the external affairs or corporate affairs departments I mentioned before. And in a recent study, McKinsey looked at reinventing that function. And the research they did suggests that most executives recognize the necessity and importance of stakeholder engagement. That's the function's core mandate, is to engage with stakeholders. Yet the surveyed CEOs also reveal that their organizations still lack the external affairs capabilities they need to succeed. Furthermore, respondents reported little progress and even declines in the strength of their company's capabilities since 2012. For years now, our daily news have been full of evidence of the rising importance of these issues, not only for the tech sector, but for society as a whole. The breadth and depth of these global challenges is truly staggering. So I spent some time trying to collect just a few of my favorite issues and headlines. Environmental sustainability issues. This is an employee walkout staged at Amazon headquarters in Seattle. Climate change. Facial recognition technology and its implications for privacy. Government surveillance. Net neutrality. Support of government censorship. Security, hacking, ransomware. Just this week, we learned about the hacking of multiple verified Twitter accounts, which apparently was accomplished with some inside help from a Twitter employee. Data localization, especially in countries with less than stellar privacy track record. International data flows. Just this week, a major decision by the European Court of Justice struck down the EU-US Privacy Shield, the agreement that enabled the essential data flows between the two countries across the Atlantic. Law enforcement access to digital personal data. Concerns about overreaching orders and the secrecy of the warrants that law enforcement agencies sometimes provide to tech companies. Artificial intelligence regulations and the implications for society, a whole range of issues from discriminatory algorithms to other kinds of biases built into those algorithms. Digital taxation and the transfer pricing structure that companies use to plan their tax payments around the world. Foreign interference in election and the leveraging of technology, data, and social networks in order to accomplish this. My personal favorite, online platform neutrality, self-preferencing, App Store policies, and its conformity with antitrust and competition law principles. Data aggregation through company acquisitions, as well as market leveraging. The gig economy, the rights of employees in the cases of this new tech companies with gig economy business models. The disruption of small businesses, mom and pop shops by online platforms. Cyber currencies like Libra or Bitcoin or others, and the regulatory and monetary and potential criminal implications of having unregulated currencies trading in the market. Gender equality and representation, and the gender pay gap in the context of the Me Too discussions that brought these issues to the forefront in the last couple of years. Sexual harassment and the company's treatment of people who are accused of sexual harassment, where they typically are given golden parachutes and paid this enormous amounts of money to have them leave the company. You know, this whole thing is beginning to change the way we perceive companies. The reputational impact and ultimately the business impact of these issues can be very significant. The other thing that's quite important is this new phenomenon. And if you look at the literature on stakeholder management, rarely you find references to the employees as stakeholders. And yet it is clear that employee activism is really become a significant check on the activities, particularly of tech companies. You've seen multiple of those walkouts. I've shown you images of the ones in the context of Google and Amazon. Even in the context of the pandemic, there have been virtual walkouts by employees that had been staged, trying to advocate for issues that they care about. Racial justice, diversity and inclusion issues, and racial pay gap. These are things that obviously we've been dealing with in the last few months in the United States as a result of cases of alleged police brutality and the actual killing, in some cases videotaped and shown to the world of killings of Black Americans by police. And then the role that social media and technology companies have, not only in terms of how they communicate about it and how they moderate the debate on these issues, but also the way they themselves are structured and the representation within the companies themselves. And that leads to this issue that is one of the thorniest issues that we're facing today, which is this notion of content moderation. Issues ranging from free speech, hate speech, political advertising as a form of speech, platform censorship, and areas in which, frankly, there's a tremendous debate in society over the proper role of these technology platforms in moderating and somehow curating the content. And whether some believe that they should opt for a free speech approach, others believe that they should take a much more active role in curating and scrubbing the content on their platforms. Now, I don't really have a talking point for this slide. I just wanted to give you a chance to breathe and relax after all of that. My heart rate goes up after I think of all these issues, because these are issues that I actually have to think about almost on a daily basis. This is all heavy stuff. And each and every one of those topics is complex by itself. Just imagine trying to find the right answers across different countries around the world, across cultures, across religions, different senses of morality. And society is asking corporations to find the right answers to these things with little or no guidance from the law or legislators or international treaties. These are areas that haven't been legislated or regulated. These are very active discussions with tremendous divisions on opinion, and yet we expect corporations who have not been elected by anyone to any kind of office to make these decisions on these critical issues to society. On this issue of content moderation on online platforms like Twitter and Facebook, YouTube, and others, think about it this way. Everyone has a different level of tolerance and or definition of what they believe may be offensive or abusive. Every individual has a perspective on that. This may be influenced by a lot of factors, where you're from, cultural norms or considerations, religious beliefs or non-beliefs, life experiences, language differences, etc. There's a patchwork of ever-changing regulations around the world, a patchwork of laws even at the state level in the US. Expressions that mean one thing in one country mean something totally offensive in a different country. And in the background of all of this, you have people who are intent on abusing and gaming that system. There are bad actors out there, like you are going to find in every time there's an opportunity to do that, to misinform, to manipulate, to profit from the situations. These bad actors are constantly evolving their tactics, and their trends are always changing. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that, at least from the point of view of this technology and society issues, the world is literally and figuratively on fire. I mean, they're extremely polarized view. Tech companies are charged with writing one set of policies for hundreds of millions of different people, billions of people around the world, who all have different definitions of abuse and thresholds of their tolerance. It is really impossible to get this right and make everyone happy. But not only do we have to deal with all those things, tech companies have to do that essentially as they're building these new products and these new services, which in many ways are just in the nascent stage of their development. So they're essentially building a plane as they're trying to fly it. Just imagine the scale of the complexity here and what's at stake, not only for the companies themselves, but for society as a whole. So today's corporations are often well geared to fight legislation that negatively impacts them. They know how to lobby, they know how to try to kill a legislative initiative or to try to push one, but that alone is no longer sufficient in this world. Focusing on common ground with governments and other key stakeholders might really reveal new opportunities, which otherwise would be obscured if the framing of the public-private relationship is just that contentious adversarial process. So how does one begin to address these challenges, and who can lead the charge? Now, I've said external affairs and corporate affairs, they aren't uniformly organized. They're called different things. They mean different things for different companies, but usually they include departments that cover communications or public relations, government and regulatory affairs, public policy, corporate social responsibility. These teams are the ones that are charged with corporate diplomacy. Michael Watkins defines corporate diplomacy as the role senior executives play in advancing the corporate interest by negotiating and creating alliances with key external players, including governments, analysts, media, NGOs, etc. In the tech world, the gold standard of corporate diplomacy is, perhaps somewhat ironically, embodied by no other than Microsoft. And who I believe is its secret weapon, its president and chief legal officer, Brad Smith. I think it is useful to think about the archetypical corporate diplomat because it helps us really grasp the contours and the potential impact that the function can have in the corporate environment, particularly in the tech world. Brad is someone I've had the privilege of working closely for and with for almost 18 years, including the years of the antitrust battles on both sides of the Atlantic, but also the years during which Brad helped lead the remarkable transformation of the company, more recently under the tremendous leadership of Satya Nadella, its CEO. Microsoft's experience and transformation is a valuable lesson for all of us in the technology sector today. Last year, Brad and another Microsoft employee, Caroline Brown, published a book entitled Tools and Weapons, the Promise and the Peril of the Digital Age. In the book, they recount how Microsoft found itself in some of the thorniest tech policy issues of our time and the difficult, often high-stakes decisions they had to make. In the foreword of the book, Bill Gates talks about the role Brad played in persuading him and others that a new approach to stakeholder management was necessary if the company was to disentangle itself from the conflict with governments and competitors that had plagued it for the previous decade. Bill in the foreword says, in the early days of Microsoft, I prided myself on how little time we spent talking about people in the federal government. I would tell people, isn't it great that we can be successful and not even have an office in DC? As I learned the hard way during the antitrust suit, this was not a wise position to take. And then he goes on to say, after the case was settled, Brad persuaded me and a lot of other people at Microsoft that we needed to take a different approach. We saw that we needed to put more time and energy into connecting with different constituencies, including government, our partners, and sometimes even our competitors. Brad would have made a great diplomat, he said. Now, during his interview for the role of General Counsel, where he interviewed with Bill Gates and other people, Brad showed up with a single slide that essentially declared that Microsoft needed to make peace with its foes. It's vague. The slide said something like, it's time to make peace. At the time, Microsoft was widely seen as a bully. Changing the company's legal stance in the antitrust case, as well as later legal stances the company has taken over the years and continues to take not only in legal, but a number of societal issues, has helped the company soften its company's public image to the point where they're really regarded to a certain extent like the adult in the room, the conscience of the tech industry. Now you can hear directly from Brad in this BBC interview about his take on the role the antitrust battles had on accelerating the development of this approach.
20 years ago, Microsoft was fighting not to be broken up. Today, it's got the biggest market cap in the world, and I think in your book you argue that perhaps you're the best place for the big tech to deal with the regulatory pressures that are out there. In retrospect, do you think it was a good thing that that happened to Microsoft?
Well, I don't know that it was a good thing, but it was definitely both a humbling experience and ultimately a learning opportunity. We took away from what was a very difficult time. I think a real sense that we needed to step up as a company. We needed to understand the concerns that other people had about us. We needed to change. We needed to mature. And I think that has, in fact, served us well. I think there are some lessons to be learned that are probably applicable to more than ourselves for the future.
Now, but even a consummate corporate diplomat like Brad occasionally has to stand on principle to prove that its position is more than just PR spin. Tools and Weapons recounts the time when the Snowden disclosures came out and how Brad not only took the decision to sue the US government, but then pursued an industry-wide effort to limit the damage. The purpose of the lawsuit was to challenge the gag orders issued by the FISA court that prohibited Microsoft from telling its customers that Microsoft had received a warrant for the customer's data. So Microsoft was being forced to turn over personal data, and the customer never had any news that this has happened, nor did they have an opportunity to present any defenses or any arguments in the case. Now, given the history of litigation between Microsoft and the US government, just imagine how difficult it was for the company to decide to voluntarily file a lawsuit against its own government. But Brad understood that restoring trust from Microsoft customers was essential to Microsoft's success. It's not a question about being nice. This was a question of achieving the essential rebuilding of the trust that a technology company in general, but Microsoft specifically, needed from its customers if it was going to succeed from a business perspective in the long run. So at a time when tech companies were being accused of acquiescing to overbroad personal data sweeps by government, it was important for Microsoft, and it was important for the technology industry to stand up to those things and prove to customers that they would protect their data with the utmost zeal. Now, unbeknownst to Microsoft, Google had filed a similar challenge around the same time. And then the next thing that Brad did was quite significant. We talked about challenging the US government, but then the other thing that a corporate diplomat knows how to do is he or she knows how to work with the company's competitors in order to achieve things that are of business and societal value. Brad picked up the phone and called his counterpart at Google, Kent Walker. Here you see them talking to one another, to explore whether the companies could gain strength by working together on a settlement with the government on data collection. The overture was remarkable considering, the history between Microsoft and Google, what ferocious business rivals they were in an industry where competitors were not really used to working together, like you might see them in some other industries, including in the tech industry, like telcos and others, where you see much more cooperation than you see them in the software industry. But the two companies, because of the leadership of these two individuals, really put aside their hostilities, and they and other technology companies reached eventually a deal with the Obama administration that brought the litigation to an end. Now, to illustrate the age, the kinds of things that Brad would do in terms of creating this narrative and being able to be an advocate out there, not only for Microsoft, for issues that are important to the industry, I have a number of things that I want to show you. He's really out there on the speaker circle. Here you see them in Congress testifying in the context of the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 and advocating for some amendments. What you see there is showing one of the early IBM PCs and a floppy disk to illustrate what the technology looked like at the time when the ECPA, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act, was originally enacted, and as a way of visibly demonstrate how antiquated that legislation was in the context of the technology advances of the time. You see them talking about technology and society in important media forums. You see them talking to Trevor Noah about some of these issues. You see him recognized as not only one of technology industry's most high-profile commentators, as this article says, but really the statesman of the technology industry. He's laid the groundwork for what he calls a digital Geneva Convention to really put restrictions and create an international agreement that would restrict nation actors from actually compromising personal data of individuals in the context of their cyber war scenarios. You see him here really taking a different approach that many other companies take when it comes to employee activism. In the case of Google, the company shut down weekly meetings with its employees where they used to be able to share their views once they saw signs of this activism and the tone of the conversations changed. Brad instead came out publicly and he said that the company welcomes employee dissent and says other tech companies don't listen to the employees enough. He said, every time we hear from our employees, we have the opportunity to learn. It doesn't mean that we'll necessarily reach the same conclusions, but we do get smarter. This is an excellent example of stakeholder management and really building bridges and relationship with all of those essential stakeholders. Now, you see, how is it possible? What has Microsoft done in order to achieve this goal? And is not just that they have a remarkable individual in Brad Smith personally with a tremendous foresight and a tremendous command of history that allows him to provide the context around the issues that we're facing today. Like, he's created what's called Microsoft's Digital Diplomacy Unit, which are policy experts who work on everything from the ethical use of artificial intelligence to protecting the 2020 presidential election from foreign cyber interference. This is the kind of focus that a sophisticated company will take. So in closing, whether companies like it or not, they cannot afford not to deal with the interests, the institutions, the ideas, and the rules that are outside their strict market domain. Corporate diplomats manage systematically and professionally the business environment in such a way to ensure that business is done smoothly. That is to say, with an unquestioned license to operate and an interaction that leads to mutual adaptation between corporations and society. The central theme of corporate diplomacy focuses on the question how companies can meet the social expectation of society without sacrificing their mission, which is to generate a profit by satisfying market demands. Companies, and especially technology companies, will ignore the demands of the time at their peril. Thank you.